Hey, what's going on guys? Today I'm going to show you how you can implement React with Firebase and use it to authenticate users and also protect your front-end routes. We'll do this all using the Context API as well, so we don't need something like Redux to manage our user state locally. So let's just get straight into it. This should take about 20 to 30 minutes, so let's just dive in. Alright guys, so I've got an empty folder here open, and now what we want to do is we'll just create a new React app, and I'm going to use Vite or Vite, however you pronounce it. We'll also need the Firebase SDK, and we'll also need React Router DOM for our front-end routing. So I'm just going to go to Google and just type in React Vite, and we just go to the Get Started. If we go down here, I can copy this this command here, which we can run in our terminal. So I'll go back to Visual Studio Code, start a new terminal session, and just paste this in. And this is going to ask us for a project name. I'm just going to do dot so it creates the project under the current directory, and the rest I'll just enter through. And I think my terminal is a bit small, so there we go. So I want React, and I'm just using JavaScript today. Cool. Alright, so now we can also install React Router DOM, and we also want Firebase. So I'll install those two packages, and while that's installing, I'm actually going to go to our Firebase console and start up a new Firebase project. Alright, so my Firebase project is going to be called Dan's React FB. Continue, and just select an account. I've got a bunch of accounts here from old projects, so pick whatever one you want to use, or otherwise create a new one, create a new project. And while this spins up, I'm just going to go back to our code editor, and this is still going too. So that's cool. Alright, so now this is finished installing React Router DOM and Firebase. We still need to install React, I'm pretty sure as well. So I'm just going to run npm I, and this should install the rest of the package that we need. Cool. Alright, so just going back to our browser, it looks like our project is ready. Just continue and we'll get redirected. So we want to go to web here, and we're just going to register a new web app under our project. So I'm also going to call this my React app. I don't want hosting, I'm just going to register the app and just get the config details that we need for the SDK, which should be here in a second. Cool, so we've already installed Firebase, so really all we want is this stuff right here. So I'm just going to copy this and go back to our code editor, and I'm just going to put this under the source directory, and I will put this as fbconfig.js and just paste that in there, and we'll leave that there for now. Alright, sweet. So now that we have everything in place in terms of modules in our Firebase project, I'm just going to go npm run dev to start up the local development server. And you'll see here there'll be a bunch of just sort of boilerplate stuff that we get from the default Vite or Vite application. So I just want to gut this, just pretty much just get rid of everything that's here, so we're working with a fresh, clean slate. So let's go back to our code editor, and I pretty much want to get rid of these two imports here for the images, and I'm also going to get rid of everything else here as well. And this will be the root of our application, so I'm just going to write h1 here and say root, or we'll just say welcome. How about that? That's a bit nicer. And I'm also going to get rid of this use state and that one there too for now also. So if I save this off and we'll go back to our app, we can just see a welcome page here being displayed, which is cool. Alright, so now that we have these set up, I just want to initialize the Firebase in our application. So let's go to our main.jsx, and actually, sorry, let's go back to our FB config, and we need to export this. So I'm just going to say export const, actually I'll say export default, and just like that, we can save this off. Alright, so now in our main.jsx file, we want to initialize Firebase. So I'm going to import our config file in here, And I also want to import the initialize app function from the Firebase SDK. So I'll also import initialize app. I don't know why the IntelliSense isn't coming up there, but Firebase /app, and that's where it is there. Alright, so you can see this initialize app function takes in a Firebase options parameter, which is basically this config file that we created. So we can just say const app equals initialize app and pass in fb config. Okay, so let's just save that off, and that is all good. Alright, so with Firebase initialized, we want to now just set up some page components and some routes for our application so that we can actually navigate to like a sign-in page, a sign-up page, and we also have that root of the application page already, which I'll also create a home page too. So what we're going to do is go to our source folder, and under here we'll create a new folder called routes. And in the routes folder, I'm going to create 3 routes. So we'll say signin.jsx and signup.jsx. And in signin.jsx, we'll just say export function signin, and we'll just return a h1 which says this is the sign in page. I'm just going to copy this because we'll need something similar. And we'll do the same thing for a sign up page as well. A sign up page, sorry. And then also we'll do the same for a home page as well. So let's just say home.jsx, and this is home there. Okay, so now that we have the page component set up, we need to actually define the router so we can actually navigate to these page components. So back in our app.jsx file, let's define a new router here, and then we'll render the router instead of just this h1 welcome. Alright, so from the top here, we want to import those page components that we just created. So let's say import signin, import home, sign up, and import home. Alright, so those are our 3 page components, and now we also want to import some stuff from React Router DOM. So let's import create browser router and also router provider. Oops. Alright, just those 2 is what we need from React Router DOM. Alright, so in our app function, we want to create a new router here at the top. So I'm just going to say const router equals create browser router, and this is going to take in an array of objects which we can then define our paths and the components or the elements to be rendered. So let's create a new object in here, and we'll say path, and this is say the root of the application, and this is going to return the element which is the home element. So I'll write that just like that. I'll do a simpler thing now for our sign in and sign up pages. So sign in will have the sign in component, and you could probably guess the sign up page has the sign up component. Alright, so I'll save that off and just make sure we've got our commas here so we don't get any errors. Just save this off again. And now we just want to return this router below here. So under, instead of this h1, we can instead now say router provider, and I'll say router equals router, which is this one that we just defined up here. Alright, so if I save this off, I believe that should be working now. Let's have a look. So if I go to the root of the application, I'm not getting much at the moment. Now why would that be? Let's try go to our sign in page. Let's have a look. So the requested module does not provide an export named sign in. Okay, so that sounds pretty obvious. So let's go back to our sign in component. And I'm assuming I've got one of these exports wrong. So export function sign in, sign up. So let's go back to our sign in page. Maybe just save this off just to make sure everything's saved properly. If we give this a refresh, and now that's working. Cool. Alright, so this is the sign in page, and let me go to sign up. That works. And if I go to home, we get nothing there at the moment. So let's just make sure that our route is set up properly for the home page too. Might just go to the root of the application. That's why. So we've got the root application, but we also want to have a home page, which we'll just define here as well. So under here, I'll have it as /home. Okay, cool. This looks pretty nice. So if I go back to our application and I go to /home, you can see now that's working as intended. So let's go back to our code editor and we'll create a new sign-up form. So I'm going to go to the sign-up page here and we'll go back to our sign-up page over here. Now in this sign-up page, I am instead going to wrap this h1 into a div, and we'll keep this h1 here just so we know where we are. And under this, I'm going to have now a new form, and this form is going to have two input fields, one for a email address and another one for a password. Oops. And then we just need a button as well, and this can just say sign up. Alright, so I'll just save this off. Let's have a look at what it looks like now. Alright, so we've got two input fields here, sorry. And now we want to be able to basically sign up with Firebase. So I'll just create some handlers to handle the input states. So we're going to need to import useState from React. And then we'll set up our default state values over here. So we can say const email, and then the setter, which is set email equals useState. And that's just going to be null or empty string initially. And the same thing with the password. So set password and useState will be empty too. Alright, so that's all good. And now we want to make sure that these are actually being set when anybody types anything in our form. So we can say onChange. And in here, we just have a quick arrow function which passes in the onChange event, and we'll feed this to our set email function. So we can say set email, and this will be e.target.value. So we'll do the same thing for our password field as well. So e, and then we can say set password e.target, .value. Cool. Alright, so now what we want to do is just have our handle sign in button. So we need the button to actually do something when we click it. So I'll just say on click, and we can say here will be another arrow function which calls handle sign up, which we haven't got yet. So let's have a new function up here, and we'll say async function handle sign up, just like that. And just make sure that we put our parentheses down here too. Okay, so now in our handle sign up function, I just want to first off just alert and just double check that we're getting everything set up right. So alert email password, save this off. Let's go back to our application, and I'll say test@me.com and hello. If I click sign up, you can see I'm getting that one, but I'm not getting the password. So let's go back. I think it's just because of the way that I've set up this function. Actually, it doesn't take in two parameters like that. So let's just do this and that. So we'll just concatenate it basically. Save this off, and we'll go back and try that again. Cool, that looks better. So we're getting test@me.com and hello. Alright, so we pretty much got everything in place now. All we have to do is just use the Firebase functions instead of just alerting this right here. So we're going to import a couple functions from Firebase. So we need the getAuth function, and I'll just do this from Firebase /auth, and then we'll also need the create user with email and password function. Okay, so now we've got those two functions imported. We also need to just instantiate that getAuth instance. So we can say const auth equals getAuth. And now down here, we can basically say create user with email and password, and a parameter that's needed for this is the auth instance that we just instantiated. So auth, and then just the email and the password. Alright, and now we can just say .then, and if this is successful, it's going to return back the user that was just created. So we can say user and just arrow function it out, and we'll just say console.log user, and whatever else you might want to do here. But for now, this is all we're doing. And we'll also have a .catch here in case we have any errors. We'll save this one off, and before we actually try to do this, I realized I've actually forgotten something over in our Firebase project. So now that we have this set up, I'm going to continue to console, and we need to enable authentication. So let's go to authentication, and we'll just go get started, and we need to enable the email provider for our Firebase project. So we can say email and password, enable it, I'll save it. And now if we go to our app, let's actually try to create a new user. So we'll say test at hello.com, and this will be hello123. Sign up. And there we go, we've got our credentials back here. We didn't get an error, which is great. So let's go to our Firebase project. If we go to users, and there we go, we can see we have a new user set up in our Firebase project, which is really cool. Alright, so now that we have that set up, we want to now navigate to our sign in page, so we can actually try to sign in as this user. And now we're going to go to our sign in page over here, and I think what we're going to do really is actually just I'll pretty much just copy this whole thing here. I think everything that we did in sign up, and we'll just paste it in, but just make sure that when you do that you change this to be sign in still. Okay, let's save this off, and we'll just change this one down here as well so we don't get confused. This is the sign in page, and let's go to our sign in page, and you can see it looks pretty much the same now as our sign up page. And I'll also change the wording here on the button. And alright, so that's pretty much all we need to do there. We'll just change this create user with email to be sign in with email and password instead. And this will be sign in with email and password. And I'll also change this function just to be called handle sign in instead of sign up, so we don't get confused. And I'll change it down here as well. Okay, great. So let's save this off. And last thing I want to do now is also import the navigate function from React Router DOM. So whenever a user signs in and is successful, they get redirected to the home page. So let's import the use navigate hook from React Router DOM. And over here, we can say const navigate equals use navigate. And this returns back the method that we need to be able to redirect our users. Okay, so now that we have pretty much everything in place, we're just down here. We're just going to say navigate to /home. Okay, let's save this off. And now if I go back to our application. Alright, so now trying to sign in, if I go test at hello.com and hello123, we'll sign in here. And there we go. We can see our user credentials below here in the console log, and we're also getting redirected now to the home page, which is awesome. And I think now actually I want to change something, because I think I'm noticing a little bug here. It's not actually, the sign in and sign up pages aren't working on first go. And pretty much here I just want to say we'll pass in the event and pass it in here as well. And up here we need to have a reference to it, so e there. And we can say e.prevent default. And this should now prevent the form from refreshing the page. So that's on the sign in page, and we'll do it on the sign up page also. Handle sign up e, pass it in here as well. Here we'll say e.prevent default. Oops. Okay, so now that we have our sign up and sign in functionality working, the last thing I want to do is just make sure that we can actually sign out also. So I'm going to go back to our home page, and just here I'm going to import the sign out function from Firebase Auth, and we'll also need the get auth function as well. And in here I also want to wrap this down in a div, so I'm just going to say return, and we'll have a div here as well. I'll put this back up there too, and I just want a button just below the H1, and I'm going to say sign out. So if I go async function handle sign out, and in here I'm going to just have this as a try catch, and I want to just await the sign out function, and any errors I'm just going to console.log them as well. So console.log error. And before we add that to our button, let's just get the parameters that we need for the signout, which is just the auth instance. So again, we can just say const auth equals get auth, and we could just pass this into the signout function. Alright, so let's go ahead and now add this to our button. So I can just say handle signout here. Get this as save, and we'll see how this looks in our application. Cool, so there it is. We can now see that there. And if I sign out here, it's not going to do anything really except just sign out the user on Firebase. So after signing out, it doesn't really actually do too much visibly on the screen, but this is going to be important later when we set up our protected routes and our context for auth as well. So now we're going to work towards actually protecting our routes and setting up a quick auth context, which our protected component is going to need to be able to determine if somebody is authenticated or not. So let's go and create a new auth context, which we can use throughout our application. So back in our source folder, I want to create a new folder called context, and I'm also going to create a new file under this called auth context. And in here we want to import create context, use state, and use effect from React. Some other things we're going to need from Firebase is the get auth and also the on auth state changed observer. Cool. Alright, so let's just export our function called auth context. And ultimately what this context is going to do is basically keep track of the signed in user. And this context is going to wrap around the whole React application. And particularly it's going to wrap around the router. So if we go back to our app.jsx, it's going to wrap around this router provider. So our auth context needs to be able to render that router component, which means I'm going to need to display the children of this auth context. So I can destructure the React props and get the children there so that the router will display. And now continue on with building the rest of this auth context component. So I need to get a reference to that auth instance that we have. So again, I'm going to say const auth equals get auth, and now just set up some state for our user. So I can say const user and set user. And we'll set this initially as null or just empty. And what I'm also going to want here is a loading state. So this is particularly needed for when we have a refresh on the page. We need to track if the app is finished loading yet before we try to render the router. I'm going to say const loading and set loading equals use state. And by default, this is going to be true because anytime somebody refreshes the page, the default state is that it's going to be loading. And once it's finished loading, we can later then set the loading state to false. Alright, so now we're going to use the use effect function, and in here, I basically want to use the onAuth state function, which is from Firebase, and we're going to use this to keep track of any auth changes or any state changes to the signed in user. And just down here, I want to have an empty array here, so it's just basically tracking whenever the app renders. So I'm going to just say here, let unsubscribe, and unsubscribe equals onAuth state changed. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the onAuth state changed function actually returns back a unsubscribe function as well. So we'll say onAuth state changed, and we'll pass in our auth reference, and this is going to have a callback, and this callback is basically going to provide back our signed in user. At this point as well, we can also say set loading is equal to false. And then we just want to have a conditional here so that if we do actually have a user, we'll set the state of the current user to the user that we found. Otherwise, we'll set the user state to null. Cool, so that's all we need to do there. And if we go down here, what we want to do at the end of this use effect is basically just return the unsubscribe function so that we don't get stuck in a sort of forever rendering loop. So just back at the top of our file here, we also want to export a reference to an instantiated context. So we'll say export const context equals create context. And down the bottom here, we can pretty much return this with the provider as well. So I'll say return and say context and the provider, and the value will be equal to some values which we haven't set yet. But these values are pretty much going to be the user and the set user function. So I'm just going to say here, we'll say values equals, we'll say const values, and we'll give it a user property equal to our user state, and also another set user property equal to our set user function. Alright, so now that that's there, we also need to render our children within this context. And we only want to render this as well, like I said previously, when the loading is set to false. So when we're finished loading and there's no more loading happening. So we're going to say here, when loading equals false, we'll render our children. Cool, let's just save this one off. And that is all we need for our auth context. So now going back to our app.jsx, we can now wrap our application with the auth context. So let's import our auth context, and we can pretty much wrap this here. So instead of just having this empty tag here, I'm actually just going to fill this in and say auth context. Cool. We'll save this off and we'll just go back to our application to make sure things are working. Alright, so now the last thing we need to do is just create one more new component, which is going to wrap around the components we defined in our router if we want them to be protected. So we're going to create a new component and we'll put it in the routes folder as well. And I'm going to call this protected.jsx. And a few things we're going to want here. We're going to want the navigate function from React Router DOM. And now we also need the values within the auth context that we created before. So I'm going to say import use context from React and then import the context that we created as well. So I'll say export function protected. And again, this is going to need to render whatever component it's wrapping. So I'm going to destructure the React props for the children property. Oops. So let's get a reference to our user state, which is within the context. So I can say const user equals use context and passing in this context that we imported. And now we can say if there is no user, we'll return a navigate component which will navigate to the sign in page. And we can just say that like this. Okay, and then if there is a user, so else, we'll just return the children. Alright, so I'm going to save this one off and go back to our app.jsx file and we'll import this protected component as well. And now any component that we want to protect, we simply just wrap within this protected component. So for example, this home page and the root of our application, I'll just now instead say protected. And we can put this in here. And in fact, I'll just do this like this because it's probably simpler. So I'll save this off and I'm going to do the same thing for the /home path as well. So I'll save this one off and let's go back to our page and let's try to go to our home page. So that's not working. We got redirected back to the sign in page, which is great. Let's try to go to the root of our application. That's not working too. We're getting redirected to the sign in page. Alright, so now let's try to actually sign in. And what's our email again? It's test@hello.com. Test@hello.com and then hello123. And let's try sign in. Cool, so now we are at the home page. We can see now we're signed in and we're allowed to go to the home page. If I go back to the sign in page, that's going to be no problem. If I go back to the home page, that's going to be no problem because we're still signed in. So again, once we sign out, we cannot go back to the home page, which is great. So that's going to be it, guys. I hope you learned something today. Hopefully it wasn't too difficult and you can see that it's not too hard to set up React and Firebase and get your auth and protected routes all set up. What you can do as well, which I skipped over in the video, is to actually have the sign in and sign out functions within the auth context. But I wanted to keep that part of the video kind of simple and just sort of really focus on just getting the user authenticated and managing the state of that authenticated user through the auth context. So that's going to be it, guys. I hope you guys learned something again, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe for more content just like this. Cheers.